Good afternoon. Greetings from the Sun Belt of the United States, Atlanta, Georgia, where it is now about 45 degrees and heading down. I know that many of you are in colder parts of the country, so we certainly sympathize with you. This is Firestorm. We've got a webinar today being presented in conjunction with our good friends at RenWeb, and we invite you to become our friend at Facebook. This is Firestorm Solutions is our Facebook account. You may also follow us on Twitter at Firestorm Soul. There is a hashtag for the session. That's Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risks and crises. Firestorm's expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communication, crisis public relations, and consequence management. We advise you that this presentation is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion. And the work product that we discussed today must be read in conjunction with your organization's personal counsel. In addition, the information given and comments should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. The RenWeb organization and Firestorm do present this Crisis Coach webinar series. This is number 13 in the monthly series of webinars that RenWeb is providing to their customers and their friends and families as part of the transfer information from us to you. You can go to firestorm.com/RenWeb. You can watch past webinars. You can also register for future webinars. Our topic today is on workplace violence risk. And we go through a lot of things today to review how you can avoid having a risk in your organization. This series is provided by the RenWeb, and we're pleased to have with us Jacqueline Day, who's in scenic, wonderful Maryland, and she's going to make some comments for us now. Jacqueline, over to you, please.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and yes, my name is Jacqueline Day, and I am the Director of Communications at RenWeb, and I have been sitting in on most of these Firestorm webinars over the past year or so, and I just want to thank everyone for joining today, and if you are a repeat visitor to these webinars, welcome again, and if you're new, I know that you're going to find these webinars very useful, informative, and very timely as well. I have enjoyed learning with all of you. So to all of the RenWeb clients on the line, hi and welcome. And for those of you who may not be a RenWeb customer yet, welcome as well. And I hope that you enjoyed today's webinar. I'm looking forward to it. So back over to you guys. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jacqueline. It's always great to be around you and hear and work with our friends at RenWeb. One of the things we want to talk about today is we're going to be talking about a fairly serious subject, workplace violence. And we normally start our webinars talking about just a Firestorm update of what we've been seeing in the news. And I think when we think about violence, the shootings that occurred out in Washington just recently are probably top of mind for most everyone. And the fact that this was a situation that occurred where there were warning signs and events that could have happened that could have made a difference at that school, and perhaps the difference of even life and death for some of the young people involved. It's an interesting position for us to find. So as we talk about this today, some of the facts are disturbing as we go through, but the material here is real. We're in an environment where many things are happening continually, and we face bigger challenges in our schools today than at any other point in history. And so for the exposures are real, and they're unfortunately increasing, and the liability around those continue to increase. So when we think about workplace violence, we follow, again, a predict, plan, perform process at Firestorm. And today we're going to be talking about background checks, behavioral risk assessment, reporting and monitoring, the plans of developing a comprehensive plan within your school to be able to deal with this, and then performing the awareness and training, the testing of plans, and then finally the monitoring that must go through. as we think about it, you're going to hear today, for those of you who've been attending a lot of the webinars in the series, we're going to touch on a couple of points around behavioral risk assessment and around the social media monitoring, because they play a key role when we think about workplace violence. But we wanted to start off today, and let's talk a little bit about legal issues around workplace violence. And when you think about it, it really is in two broad categories that we're going to talk about. One is the responsibility of the employer to safeguard against preventable harm to employees, and we'll talk more about that aspect in just a minute from an OSHA perspective. And the second is to do with your obligation to respect employee rights during an investigation or disciplinary process. But we're not concerned just about employees in a school. We're concerned about our students. We're concerned about their safety as we work with them and to provide the type of an environment that's a learning environment that they can grow in every dimension within their life in coming together. And violence should not be an integral part of that. Now, when we think about OSHA, they have identified workplace violence as a known hazard. There's a duty then to protect the employee, and in our case, in schools, there's a duty to protect our students in those areas. And it's the employer's obligation. It's the obligation of your school, of your head of school, of your board, to make sure that all of these areas are there. Now, there's a common law basis that comes back when we think about workplace violence, and it's around negligence. Negligent hiring, negligent supervision, negligent retention, liability of the premise, and then how you respond to these types of acts that would come together. So we're not trying to teach a course today in law, but this is a requirement. It's not something that would be nice to have or we should think about. It is an area where we're required to do that from a legal perspective. And I think on a higher level, we're required from a moral perspective to make sure that we have a safe environment for everyone that is in this area. Now, ultimately, these types of legal requirements rise to the level that this is a governance and fiduciary responsibility for the board of your school, and their involvement will be important. We've also seen some issues where some states that held a corporation could be liable in the death or serious injury of an employee. So as we think about an event that would occur in the workplace, it is possible then that liability from a criminal standpoint, not civil, criminal, could accrue back to the head of school or the board in light of that law and the interpretations. And we're seeing similar statutes in states around the country. So the reason to start a workplace violence presentation to a school and talk about this is to give a basis to say that this is a responsibility from the board down to the classroom and everywhere in between as we think about these items. Now, a lot of us are in denial that it's just not going to happen, it's not going to happen here, and it's not going to be so bad. It's not the fact that this is impossible, it's the fact that it's just unthinkable that causes this pause. I finished reading the Dan Brown novel, the new one that came out this year called Inferno, based on Dante's Inferno there. And look at the quotes out of Dan's novel, and he does a tremendous amount of research, as you know, in these areas. The human mind has a primitive ego defense mechanism that negates all realities that produce too much stress for the brain to handle. Denial is a critical part of the human coping mechanism. Without it, we would all wake up terrified every morning about all the ways we could die. Instead, our minds block out our existential fears by focusing on stresses that we can handle, like getting to work on time. If we have a wider existential fears, we jettison them quickly, refocusing on the simple task and daily trivialities. So while we have a legal mandate, we have the pressure of how we normally think about things in our school in denial. I had the opportunity to be at a school this week, and their school that specializes in dyslexia, and their students have unique challenges and have made remarkable progress across a wide number of dimensions. And in sitting there and talking with the staff at the school, and they pointed out that Dr. Orwin, who was the originator of recognition of dyslexia back in the 1920s, was sharing that dyslexia in some cases has been called word blindness, where the student sees the sentence that says, "do not go home," and misses the word "not" because it doesn't register, and it would read the sentence as "do go home." I think in many cases when we think about violence, when we think about crises, there is a blindness that occurs and we miss those warning signs. And that's one of the areas that I want us to focus on today as we think about workplace violence. So can you identify your organization, your school's next crisis? And the answer is we can. That's Firestorm, and you can do that. And that's why we're spending the time today to talk about workplace violence. Now, can we really predict a crisis? Yes, there are warning signs, and those warning signs are the key to us, but if they go unheeded, then the problem will occur, and that will continue to happen at this point in time. What if you had learned from the indicators of that crisis and developed processes in place? Then you know what? The crisis could be averted. The violence could have never occurred. And we're going to talk about a lot of things today, and we're going to share some things. But again, the Firestorm approach, as we look at this and look at workplace violence, is to act at a point where there are behaviors of concern, not when the gun comes to school. So in our webinar today, we're not going to be talking about shelter in place and lockdown and lockout and evacuation, which are the 4 standard national protocols to be implemented in these areas, and certainly should be tested. And if you want to continue to test your plans and drills, which we'd encourage you to do, go through those exercises of a lockdown and a lockout. And I would encourage you to run one of your exercises where the students are outside on the sports field, where they're at recess. They're at a different time when the school goes into lockdown, and carrying through that process so that you're able to communicate it and understand what the strategies are to be implemented there. But it's these indicators that will really make a difference. So we have some goals here, and one of our goals is to create a school intelligence network. How do you know what's going on? How do you know what you don't know? Which was one of the titles on today's description of our webinar as we think about workplace. Our goal is to know today what will happen tomorrow. And one of the things that you'll hear, and we'll stress at a couple of points during today, what's on social media today will be in your school tomorrow. And so you need a formal program to monitor social media and references to your school. And we'll give you some examples as we continue on within doing that. Predict, plan, perform. To implement a plan so that you would predict what the vulnerabilities and threats are, what are their impacts, how are you going to monitor, what are the triggers, to activate your plan, to come together, and then to perform at the time that it needs to be. So we're focused on transforming this uncertainty into certainty so that you don't have to pick up the phone and call a parent and say your son or your daughter isn't coming home from school today. And then what are the metrics? How do we know if we're doing a good job? How do we know if those areas are carrying forward? So just like a business needs intelligence in order to plan who their customers are and what they'll buy and what the market would be, you need to have an intelligence program for your school to be able to understand where the exposures come and what we need to do from a workplace violence perspective. So we want to define a framework, identify the risks that are involved, and then we want to manage and mitigate those risks. And that's what we're going to continue to talk about today. Well, every day a school is in crisis, and these are day-to-day crises that will occur. It could be, I spoke with a head of school this week who the police had done a random walk through the school in the parking lot with their drug dogs. The dogs reacted to 2 cars, and there was residue of drugs within those 2 cars, and they related to students. And in one of the cars, there was a shotgun. To find that out in advance is better than to find it out at a later time, and it certainly had ramifications for the families and the students and everyone involved in those areas. But when we think about a crisis, it's a risk event which has not been examined, didn't plan for, and can't be mitigated or controlled at this point in time. We know that there's a risk of workplace violence in every school in America, and in fact in the international schools. We're currently working with a school in South America and helping them with the plans for their campus and location and what they needed to carry forward. And it's important to remember that a crisis isn't business as usual. It's not like school on a regular day. It's a completely different environment. A crisis is business as unusual in carrying forward. So beforehand, there are things that we do. That's called pre-action. What do we put in place? How do we have those things set up? During the actual crisis, during the actual event, during the workplace violence, we're in the emergency response mode. That's the shelter in place, lockout, lockdown, and evacuate. And then afterwards, we're going to have to deal with the consequences that come from that particular event and making sure that your plans are in those areas. Now, we started by giving you some of the legal references back into workplace violence. These are some of the metrics that are out there. 70% of workplaces, and these would include schools, have no formal workplace violence program. 43% of those people who've been threatened never report the incidents, and 24% of those who've been attacked haven't actually reported the incident. Bullying is a significant threat, and that's both physical bullying as well as cyberbullying. And as we're seeing those areas move forward, Firestorm was founded back in 2005, and one of our very first expert council members was Dr. Sierra Koop, the retired United States Surgeon General. And Dr. Koop was truly a brilliant man, and I enjoyed the conversations and time that we had together. But he cited the violence in the workplace as having its stem from the bullying in the school place, and saw a direct cause relationship there, and that was one of the areas that he worked very hard to address. You see the annual economic impact of over $120 billion as those areas have come together. But, you know, the most important crisis that you'll ever see, the worst episode of workplace violence you'll ever see, is the one that happens to you in your school. Firestorm provided crisis management support to Virginia Tech after the shootings there some 7 years ago. And that was clearly the largest episode of workplace violence in the United States. But when it's your school, if it's your students, that's going to be the worst one that you see. Now, it's more than just the financial cost of $850,000 per incident cited by NIOSH, as they have shown those areas. It's what's going to happen to the culture of your school, your school community as a result of it. So let's move a little bit into the predict area of what we can do now. We understand some of the metrics, we understand some of the legal perspectives, and we know we need to have this intelligence network coming in place. So how do we understand the threats and vulnerabilities that we have? First, we do background checks. And I know that all the schools on today say, Jim, we do background checks. It's important that we know who's in our school. And we do national background checks. We look at national database bases to be determined. So I would ask you the following questions. Who established your background check strategy? Who approved your background check strategy? Is it a waste of time, or is it critical? What's your hit rate? It's like going fishing. Are you finding lots of hits associated with it, or are you only randomly, occasionally doing it? The percentage, if you went and asked HR directors in companies and schools and businesses around the country, the annual percentage of time that they find a problem in a background check, you would be staggered to know that that's over 40%. If you're running background checks and you're finding nothing in those backgrounds, it might lead you to a question of, are our background checks following best practices? Do we do them annually in coming together? Now, if you do a national background check on an individual, it will tell you that someone has been convicted of a felony. It will not tell you if someone's been arrested for a felony. It will not tell you if they have plea bargained the felony down to a misdemeanor, and so therefore it won't appear on a national background check. The only way to find that is a search of the courthouse at the county level where the misdemeanor was recorded. And so that's an area for you to look at within the process. And working with a school this week, we were able to identify some gaps that had occurred in this area. So the standards and best practices are annual background checks down to the misdemeanor level, including the county courthouses, because they're not in the database that happens on a national basis. So in your town, in the area where you're checking that individual, you want to check their background there. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. So in some cases, we will even need to screen or investigate further. You do not want to be in a position later where we could have, would have, or should have known at that point in time that this individual was a problem. So one of the ways that we can minimize the workplace violence potential is by conducting an accurate background check on an annual basis for anyone involved with our young people. So what constitutes workplace violence? It could be a physical assault, it could be verbal, it could be threatening behavior, it could be psychological, or it could be physical. I think these are all fairly clear as we're looking in these areas. Now, we spend a lot of time talking about behavioral risk assessment and warning signs in some of our other webinars, so we don't want to spend a lot of time here. But I do want to give you the thought that there are red flags here. These red flags are perception. If someone's feeling uncomfortable, if there's an issue where there are concerns, these are the types of things that you would be seeing or hearing about and carrying forward. And while you'd be seeing these physically at your school or hearing about them at your school, they're also appearing on social media related to that student or that teacher or that spouse. We're seeing domestic violence move directly into the workplace because the spouse knows this is when my spouse will be at school. This is the time they arrive. This is when they leave. And it becomes a natural attack point as we see that domestic violence clearly move into the workplace. So we've shown you a couple of different spectrums when we think about workplace violence. This one's shown more like a thermometer as you would engage it and see it develop. Where you want to interact with workplace violence is not at the point of death, not at the point of physical injury, not even at threatening behavior, but behaviors of concern. Those signals will become the key elements in de-escalating this problem before the gun actually gets to school, before it becomes an act of physical violence in your school area. And we've seen these elements escalate so that violence sometimes comes as a defense mechanism from the bullying, from the threatening behavior that would come through. We've seen it come with multiple schools where there's suicide. If you look at the episode again in Washington this year, the student contacted all of those people that he knew, some of which he was related to be at a particular table in the school cafeteria so that when he walked in with a weapon, he could shoot them directly. So we're seeing students who have suicidal tendencies having a kill list that they would activate. We worked with a school in Florida last year where a student was identified as suicide risk. When we got them to the psychologist to be dealt with, the kill list was materialized, and that made a significant impact of the notification of the families whose children were named on those lists to be able to respond. So take away from this area that there are warning signs. Every disaster, every incident of school or workplace violence was preceded by warning signals, and those signals should be a part of the culture of who your school is and how you get help to people who need it. That's an important element and one of the most important things that you can do associated with the prevention of workplace violence. Now, you have to look at these things over time. It's not a single snapshot. If this was a red ball that we were bouncing in the air and we took a picture of it, you wouldn't be able to tell, is it on the way up or is it on the way down? So when we do threat assessments, when we look at this, we have to look at it over a period of time, and there are predetermined questions that you need to ask and answers that you need to receive in order to make that determination. If we're seeing a de-escalation, we're going to carry one series of acts into place. If it's still escalating, we obviously need to respond in a more appropriate manner. So today, there's a question, and the question is, what is everything foreseeable? And the answer is yes. And tomorrow, anyone can be found accountable. If there was an episode of workplace violence in your school, your students, your teachers, your parents will be looking to you to determine, why didn't you know about it? It was clear. Everybody saw those warning signs. And as we see revisionist history coming into play, this area will come forward, and it will be one that will be with the school that would affect your brand and reputation for years to come and will be remembered in that light. Now, so how do you know what you don't know? So if everything's foreseeable, where do we start? One, putting in an anonymous reporting program within your school. And this would be on 3 different levels. It could be as simple as a suggestion box where someone could slip a piece of paper with information in it. By the way, I will warn you, you may hear that the pudding in the cafeteria is not as good as it used to be, or there are other problems. It could be a call-in number, and we're working with some state associations to establish an anonymous reporting hotline associated so that students and teachers and parents can share information. And lastly, an application on a phone where messages could be texted in an anonymous format to communicate that element of concern. Anonymous reporting is not a high percentage of the time, but if it's enough to save one child in one school, then it's a great investment. Social media risk monitoring. What kids are talking about on social media today will be in your school tomorrow. And this is more than a Google search. There are software tools that are available, and they're as inexpensive as less than 50 cents a minute, to be 50 cents an hour, to be able to determine what's going on and what's happening within your school, and being able to relate it back to a geocode, where the person is, who they're having interactions with, so you can determine the extent and breadth and depth of the problem associated with it. And then lastly, through a formal behavioral threat risk assessment program. And I'll hit a couple of highlights of that in a moment, but it's certainly been a topic that we've talked about before, and that's the standard today. You need to have a formal behavior threat risk assessment program within your school to identify these behaviors of concern. Now, if we think of a continuum, and let's assume at one end, on the low end, there's something that happens, but it's minor. And so the administrator on duty can say, we don't really need to do anything. Our normal behavior process in the school will handle that in a routine manner. To the other end of the extreme are those behaviors that are potentially violent, a gun in the school, and we're calling 911. So those two ends are easy to see and generally will never be missed. It's the behaviors between, those that are a little bit more than a more normal discipline issue, and below that of the gun in the school, those behaviors of concern are the ones where the behavioral threat risk assessment is critical to identify. And we divide that middle ground into 3 categories: guarded, elevated, and severe. And the questions and programs that you do in interceding with that student, with the teachers, with the parents, and understanding helps you then to design the program to de-escalate that violence threat associated with it. Now, if you saw this today and it appeared about your school, I swear I'm going to stick that blue-haired freshman boy, but he looks like he could bring a gun to school, so I'm going to chill. Now, that was an actual posting at a school, and to be carried forward, you see the little circle there with the red. 9 other students in the school had shared it. So what would you do today if you saw this? What would you do today if you didn't see this to know about it and be able to go back and intervene in this particular area? We're seeing these types of postings for boys, for girls, for high school students, junior high, and elementary students in those areas. If you're not monitoring social media, you're going to be missing that opportunity and exposure. So looking for an intelligence risk watch, and that's what's going on with taking a look at this information that would come out, because your students, your staff are targets in these areas, and they're going to continue to escalate because of social media. And so if you're not positioned to respond, if you don't know that it's there, so you and your school are at increasing risk because that information is there. It's in the public domain. It's information that parents expect you to know about the threats to your school. And so if you're looking at social media as a way to just promote your school, that's great, but it goes beyond it into protecting your school. Some of the monitoring musts are having alerts that come to you 24/7 if things are there, conversation maps, who is this person talking to, custom search feeds as you would go into it, multiple users, sentiment analysis, streams and phrases. And when we think about social media and monitoring, we monitor streams, phrases, and words. A stream is made up of 10 phrases. A phrase is made up to 3 words. So if the name of your school was mentioned with a gun in that same message, you would want to know about it. And you'd want to know what the plan was, who they were talking with, what the timing in those particular elements are. That's what social media can do for you. The way you structure a program is there's a governance program that goes back either at the board or the head of your school. You have to have policies and procedures. Policies are what, procedures are how. You have to have third-party contractor due diligence, people that work with your students. What are they saying? You're responsible for that. Training of your staff, oversight for monitoring. You have to have an audit capability here. He has to report back to the board, and there has to be a periodic review. Businesses today are being regulated at a federal level to have social media risk programs in place. If it's important enough for a business to have it, why isn't it important enough for your school? So when we think about social media risk, we want to understand the message. We want to listen to what's being said. Is this a call for help? Is it a suicide? Is it a bullying aspect? Is it a physical violence threat? Does someone feel rebuffed in this basis? Evaluate who is saying it and why they're saying it, who are they saying it to. We want to engage as appropriate. We monitor, measure, and finally we're going to have to act. Now what's being said may or may not be true, so we're going to have to keep this information confidential as we process it and going forward. But it's in the public domain and you can know about it. Takeaways on social media, you will see that your school is active on it. It's very informal. You're expected to know what's being said, and you want to be able to act on that intelligence. So monitor, monitor, monitor. That's the real estate that you need to look at and understand what's going on associated with it. And it's got a tremendous reach, and we would encourage you to retain someone to work with you in these areas. So when we go back to workplace violence, it's not about the gun in the backpack. It's about intervention before the gun gets into the backpack. That's where the behavioral risk threat assessment comes in. 78% of the shooters in schools have been bullied, and that seems a common element. If you saw this happening this way in your school, you would react and you'd take action. I would remind you that we're seeing this take place on social media, and if you're not monitoring, you wouldn't know to take action. So when we go into a behavioral risk threat assessment program, there are 5 components. One is an awareness, training your teachers, training your students, training your parents on what to be looking for. There's a reporting mechanism, the anonymous reporting or the see something, say something concepts here. You have to do an impact assessment. That's an investigation and behavioral risk screening to determine, is this at a serious enough level? Is it at a guarded, elevated, or severe? Or is it a worse level involved? We have to perform case management, dealing with that student, not only for this school year, but next year and the year after it. If you have a problem with a 9th grader, we have to follow that student for the 9th, the 10th, the 11th, and the 12th grade. Those are all the areas that we're involved in and working with them as this process goes forward. What are the plans that we put in place? Are they having the actions that we wanted to have? Are we seeing a change in behavior at this point in time? And that's where the monitoring comes in. So awareness, reporting, impact assessment, case management, and monitoring. Those are the keys in a behavioral threat risk assessment program. Now, this flow chart really kind of separates it for you, and it shows you each one of the ends fairly easily. If we are dealing with a behavior of immediate concern, we're going to law enforcement. We don't have any choice. We're going to move that response immediately there. If it's at a lower level, then we're going to be letting the administrator make a decision, handle it, and maybe our normal disciplinary protocols will be sufficient to handle it. If it's at a low level, medium level, or a high level, and this would be the guarded, elevated, and severe, what are we doing in carrying forward to take those actions and steps in place? Now, behaviors of concern, here's a list again of the warning signals, and you'll see some of these now looking more of an area that you've seen students in school having these types of behaviors that could be demonstrated. But you'll notice that below the red line where it says imminent warning signs, physical fighting, severe rage, stalking, brandishing of a weapon, those are the types of severity statements that say we're much closer to violence and we have to take action. We don't have the luxury of waiting and carrying forward. So training people, have everyone being aware of what to look for makes the difference. So the threat levels lead us into different stages of actions. The low, the medium, or the high you're seeing spelled out here. It's this medium area that the focus comes in under the behavioral threat risk assessment in looking at what you need to do to evaluate that child, to determine what we need to carry forward and look at. So how is this done? Well, you need to establish a framework, have the overarching policies, and it needs to become a part of your school culture within your school, just like academics or sports or moral values are. This is a part of the culture of your school, because behind our young people today are a great many threats. Those threats, unfortunately, are increasing, not decreasing. And understanding what they're there, having plans in place, will make a difference as we move forward. So when we look at having a preparedness program in your school, and you'll see that part of the plans are under the predict the vulnerabilities and threat assessments. Under the plan, you'll see workplace violence listed there. You'll see the crisis management, the monitoring and triggers down below. Under the perform, it becomes an integral part of who your school is and what you must do in order to deal with the workplace violence threats that are associated with the world that we find ourselves in today. So why is all this really important? Well, the plans make a difference. When you're prepared, you gain something very valuable, and that's the time to intervene. And if we can intervene at a time when it's still just a behavior of concern, before there's threats, before there's attacks, or before there's even death, that's going to make it easier. We want to bring you in early in the process so that when you need the time, you have had the notice and area to be involved. If you'd like to know more about how your current plans align to standards and best practices, Firestorm would be glad to speak with you about that. As part of our strategic partnership with RenWeb, we make available a self-assessment. It's a facilitated self-assessment to help you determine where you are relative to standards and best practices. And this could be on preparedness overall, or it could be related to workplace violence or even social media risk. Cost of that's been underwritten by RenWeb, so that's a $2,500 value that comes to you and your school at no cost. We're going to try to reach out to everyone on the call today to see if you have questions in this area and to see if we can answer and help in any way as you continue to move forward. Our thanks to RenWeb for underwriting this Crisis Coach workshop series to provide you with this information, and we are excited about the relationship and partnership between our two companies. If you have questions, I would encourage you to contact us at firestorm.com. You can go to our website, fill out a contact form there, and we'll reach back out to you. Or you can send us an email directly at webinars@firestorm.com, or pick up the phone and give us a call, 800-321-2219. We're here, and we would be glad to help. So as we think about our schools, we think about them as great institutions of learning. We think about the learning environment and the growth that we see in our young people from the time they arrive until they graduate and later in their lives. And having met a lot of you through the RenWeb User Conference or working with your schools directly, I'm impressed by the number of years that you've invested in this area and the return that's made in the lives that you've touched. But there's a threat, and workplace violence is a very real and serious threat. Unfortunately, we'll turn on the television and watch the news, and we'll see another story. We'll see another threat that's happened in a school, and they weren't prepared. And as a difference, it will change lives forever. One of the things, if we're working with you in a crisis environment, we'll tell you that if you're explaining, you're losing in a crisis, because there's no way to explain the death of a child. There's no one to explain that this occurred in your school. So we encourage you to have plans, train your people, make sure that people are aware, start to look at these types of things, because they're as important to you in every aspect of your school that you currently are implementing. So thank you for investing time with us today. We appreciate that greatly. We look forward to speaking with you in the future or seeing you at one of the RenWeb meetings, and particularly the user group meeting next summer. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for your time. Goodbye.